Hi there. Here's what to expect from the series. If you'd rather get straight into the first episode, feel free to jump ahead using the chapter markers. This is my attempt at jamming as many little pieces of Godot fundamentals into a simple framework for a 2D platformer. While I have no plans on taking it any further, it could be improved and reworked into a Metroidvania game or similar platformer genre. If nothing else, it will be a great learning tool for those who are new to Godot 4 and want to get a simple game up and running. There are plenty of other devlogs and tutorials out there on building Godot games, so I'm going to focus on the nuts and bolts as they apply to making a basic platformer game. And I'll be highlighting those important pieces of Godot that are used in various parts of the demo game and code. While not necessary, to get the most out of this series, some prior knowledge of Godot or game development concepts would be helpful. This project was originally written in Godot 3.5 but was recently migrated to Godot 4, specifically for this series. It uses the built-in GDScript language. I'll make a few call-outs on common hurdles I encountered during that migration, but the focus is going to be on the new shiny 4.0. Before we begin, keep in mind I'm not a graphics artist and my programmer art can and will be absolutely terrible. You won't find advanced shader code, large animated sprites, optimized frame rates, or speedy algorithms, or any other eye-candy techniques in this series. We'll focus on the building blocks of gameplay. The components of this game are not intended to look visually stunning, but rather they're meant to showcase the logic and moving parts of a Godot game in action. I hope that makes sense. If there's enough interest, I might package up this project and place it on GitHub for subscribers to check out. However, the music and audio I'm using are licensed for use only on YouTube, so I won't be providing those assets. The series is broken down into 6 easier-to-digest episodes, each one building on the episode before them. By the end, we'll have a mini platformer game running in Godot 4, and you'll have a good understanding of how all of the pieces fit together. We'll start by doing some prep work like setting up Godot's project settings, looking at the PS4 DualShock controller, and configuring it in Godot's input settings. We'll be explaining the few global objects in the project, and finally we'll do a quick review of the folder structure. Then in episode 2, we'll check out the 3 main Godot scenes used in the project. These are the game scene, the player scene, and the level scene. There are more scenes, but these 3 make up the base of the game logic. Using these scenes, we'll learn about the core game components like startup, pausing, and scoring in the game. Next, we'll take a quick tour of the UI and the tile map elements of the game in episode 3. We'll use Godot's canvas layers to stack different drawing layers like a HUD and scrolling backgrounds. And we'll use a tile set and tile map to create the level that we'll go to in more detail in a later episode. Episode 4 is a big one. We'll dive deeper into the player scene, including covering common mechanics such as stats, movement, collision, the state machine, the camera, lights, and sound. At last, in episode 5, we'll break down the centerpiece of the game framework, the level scene, where we'll dive into details on the tile set, item upgrade placement, enemies and boss, hazards, and background music. At the end, in the final episode, we'll talk about some of the ideas that could be added to the game relatively easily. Things like a start screen, a replay button, adding saved games, adding a mini-map, adding new tiles to the tile set, or even adding new weapons, enemies, AI, and new bosses. And so, with the intro out of the way, let's begin. I always like to start by looking at the project settings. This is where several important settings are found in various tabs. On the General tab, we have the application, display, and layer names that we'll look at in more detail. On Application Run, here we'll tell the game the first scene that runs when the game is started. In this case, the game scene is what we want. In the Display Window Viewport Size setting, here we'll set the window mode and viewport resolution for the game. The demo will be windowed to allow us to easily watch any debug output in the editor while the game's running. In the Layer Names 2D Physics section, here we'll give the names of the physics layers in the game. This is much easier than trying to remember the layer numbers. The layers in the demo are the player, the tiles, the player triggers, the bullets, the enemies, and the hazards. The player, this one's pretty easy to understand. The tiles, this one represents the hard tiles in the tile set level, things like walls and floors. The player triggers in this layer are all the trigger points that the player can interact with, like picking up items or toggling switches. In the bullets layer, bullets go zoom and impact layers like tiles, enemies, and the player. The baddies layer is where the monsters and bosses reside. Like the tiles layer, the hazards act as floors and walls but will damage and stagger the player if they touch them. On the Input Map tab, we'll configure input keys for the game. We'll set up keys on the keyboard and also set up the buttons for a PlayStation 4 controller. Most of these buttons are given friendly names, and so this is easier than it used to be. Most of these input actions are self-explanatory as to what they do, and we'll see a few of them in code in a later episode. Next up is the Auto Load tab. The game will use a globals script which allows any part of the game code to access important data objects quickly and easily. To enable the feature, we have a single file enabled on the Autoload tab, globals.gd. We'll look at the globals in more detail in the next episode. That covers the project settings that are important in the game. Now let's take a look at the file system. The game is organized into various folders. The root resource folder contains the main game scene, globals, and matching scripts. All other scenes are stored in the scenes folder. The graphic and audio assets are stored in the assets folder. Besides the game screen and globals, all other scripts are stored in the scripts folder. And this folder is broken down further to make things more organized. Scripts for enemies, projectiles, the state machine, and player triggers all have their own subfolders. And that covers the prep work for the project. It should give you a good map of where the important game level settings and assets are found in the editor. Next up, in episode 2, we're going to look closer at the 3 main scenes in the game and the main game loop. Thanks for watching.